Okay, so in the previous lecture I talked about the large-scale architecture of World of Warcraft. I talked about technically how it's put together. And we went through this idea of the tiers. We also went through this idea of algorithms getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Now I want to pick it apart in a slightly different way, but it uses a lot of the same concepts. And that's to use this idea of functionality or functions, and to say that you can take any computer program and break it into a set of functions. The functions are the main things that it does, and each of those functions has particular qualities to it. When we talk about a function, we can point to these specific things. The function has a purpose. What does it accomplish? Why would you engage this function? Why would you do this function? It has a user interface. The user interface is what does the user see that allows them to start the function, that allows them to control the function, etc., stop the function. It has a procedure. And we saw some of these procedures earlier where the procedure was all about what does it look like from the end user standpoint? What does the end user do? And it has an algorithm. We talked about algorithms as well. They were more the process from what does the server do, what does the client do, that back and forth sort of thing. So we're going to continue on that theme here, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail about some of the specifics of the play of World of Warcraft. And then it has some impact on the data. At the end of the function, some of the information that is stored or modeled or whatever of the information is changed. Okay, so you may hear this idea of a feature. A feature is kind of the end user view of a function. So if I was to say what's the difference between a feature and a function, I would say they both have the same purpose, and you say the UI and the user procedure, that's the feature part, and it turns into a function when you start talking about the algorithm and the impact on the data. Okay, so what's a function versus programming? Well, we saw in the last lecture that when you get these functions smaller and smaller and smaller, eventually you're getting to the level where what you're actually talking about is a piece of programming. So a function has programming behind it. The algorithm particularly is the thing that gets programmed. If we can get that algorithm down to a small enough level, then we can start to write some computer code to make it happen. Okay, so let's look at World of Warcraft in that way. You can tell a lot about what a system does by its major functions, how those functions break down. All of the applications that we've studied have login and profiling functions. Facebook has these major functional areas, and that's the way to think of this. These are the top level things that it does, the big categories that everything falls into. It has uploading stuff, it has making connections with people, and it has communicating with people. Those are the major things that you do in Facebook, right? And if you think about it, yep, that basically kind of nails it. In Google search, you know, we've talked about this before. You submit queries, you get results, and you display those results. Those are the big things that you do, the big functional elements, the big parts of Google. And then in World of Warcraft, at the very highest level, you configure characters, you form groups, and you play the game. Okay, so we're going to dive deeper and deeper into the World of Warcraft functions as we go along. Okay, so first I'll point you to the overall user interface of World of Warcraft. And you can just kind of scan each of these things. It won't really mean that much to you now. If you're a player, then you recognize all this stuff. If you're not, this should just give you a sort of a visual representation of what the user interface overall in the World of Warcraft looks like. So don't worry too much about understanding all these things. If you're not a player, just kind of glance at this and say, oh, you know, what does it look like? I see there's some creatures over there. There's some gauges up here. We'll talk about a lot of that stuff later, and that's about all you're going to need to know. Okay, so what are the major features inside of play? Now remember, we said configuring characters, communicating, and play. Forming groups and play. What do you do inside of playing? So what we're doing is we're making kind of an outline. We're breaking down the functions smaller and smaller and smaller. We're not going to go a whole lot smaller than this, but we will zoom in one more layer. And so within playing, things you do are move, things you do are fight, things you do are collect up stuff, you trade stuff, and you communicate with other players. Those are the major functional areas, the major different things that you do inside of World of Warcraft. Okay, so inside of play, you move, fight, collect, trade, and communicate. Okay, play is one of the major functions of World of Warcraft. Okay, so now I have to give you a little bit of an introduction to how the play works before we can start talking about the functions of play. So here's how it works. And we're going to focus in sort of on the attack part of play. So in a moment we'll get down to the details about attack, but let me just give you this overview first. We have mobs. I've talked about those before. Those are the monsters. Those are the bad guys. They're controlled by the server. There's not a person behind the mob. It's controlled by the server. And that's what all the people you group up with are attacking. Then the attackers fall into really these three different categories. There are tanks, damage dealers, and healers. Don't worry too much about this vocabulary. This is really just for background. And of course, if you're a player already, you already know this stuff. The tanks, so this fight, and this is the way that I like to think about it, this fight is all about damage. You do damage to the creature does damage to, or the mob in this case as they call it, does damage to you. And if you all die before the mob does, then you lose. If you can manage to defeat the mob, then you guys win. Okay, so the tank is there to absorb a lot of the attack from the mob. So the mob is throwing stuff at your group, and the tank is there to absorb all of that, all the pain, right? They have a very high pain threshold. Okay, the damage dealers are the attackers, basically. They're the ones that are going to end up defeating the monster, defeating the mob. And then there's healers. And the healers, from the inside Warcraft terminology, what they do is they increase your health. They get you better and better. But really, from our terminology and the way that we're looking at this thing, it's all about damage. The healers can increase damage. The tanks deflect damage so that it doesn't hit the attackers. And the attackers, called the damage dealers, are the ones that are inflicting damage on the mob, on the monster. And if they inflict enough damage on the mob, on the monster, it dies, and then you go on to the next part. Get the idea? Okay, so now let's go into the major functions inside of this idea of fighting. You engage a mob and you fight it. You approach the mob. That's the bad guy, the creep, the monster. You attack the monster. You attack the mob, and then you loot the mob. Okay, so now we've gone down even further. So part of play is attacking. Part of attacking is approaching, the actual attack, and then the looting. Okay, so we've gone down sort of an outline or a hierarchy of functions. The largest functional categories down to smaller functional categories. And as you could imagine, this is not the end of the line. We can go down to smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller functions. But by looking at these functions, you'll have a way of understanding what's going on in a really kind of clean and clear way. Okay, so those are the major functions. Now let's go into each one of them in turn. The first one is approach. And in a way, this is a review of what we talked about last time when we talked about the small-scale algorithms for moving around. So I want to sort of review, I want to sort of go a little bit deeper, and I want to put this in that overall template, this overall context for what a function does. Function has a purpose, it has a user interface, it has a procedure, it has an algorithm, and it has an impact on data. And so we're going to go through each of these in turn. They can't all fit on one slide, so I'll do purpose, user interface, and procedure first, and then we'll go on to the other two. Okay, so the function is approach. One of the things that you have to do, one of the functions that you have to engage is approaching. Approaching really boils down to moving, right? So the purpose of approach is to move through space towards your goals. And in this case, the goal is engaging with a mob, engaging with a monster. Okay, and what's the user interface for it? Well, we've seen the user interface before. It's the keyboard. These keys make you move through space. There's also a mouse interface to it, but basically, very simple user interface. It's a keyboard or a mouse. You don't really even see anything on the screen. In some games, I don't think Warcraft has this. You have a little thing on the screen that you can click and it'll move you forward. Maybe Warcraft does have one of those. I don't know. Anyway, for the most part, the user interface is the keyboard. It's also the mouse, so you don't really see anything on the screen. What's the procedure? You choose a movement command, one of these keys. You observe the effect on your location, and then you go back to step one. Choose another command. So you're doing the command, you're pressing the forward button, you're watching it move you forward, and then you're making a decision, do I want to move forward more or not? Okay? So that's where that's this function. Now let's look at the algorithm. So we have clients and servers, and I'm going to boil it down really to the client and the server. I'm not going to talk much about the data layer in these examples. The algorithm is that the client sends a movement command to the server. The server then communicates back to the client where other group members are, so where the rest of the people on the screen are, which mob is in range, so I move and now all of a sudden I come close enough to be able to attack it. It'll tell me that, and where is it, and which graphics and behavior to access to represent the mob. So I'm approaching a particular kind of monster, I'm approaching a particular kind of mob. Which of my huge number of library of graphics that I have on my hard drive should you put on the screen and display? Okay, that's what's going on. That's the That's the server's response. And again, as I remember, as I say, we go round and round and round in this algorithm. And then what's the impact on data? Well, it just impacts all the character positions. So if you were to exit the game at that moment, you would save that character position to the database, and then when you enter again, it would load your position in the territory, and you would materialize back in that same spot. Unless there are some other rules to the contrary, which there always are, that would make you materialize somewhere else, like at home or whatever. Okay, so you get it? We have a function. That function is called approach, and that approach is movement. There's a user interface to it. There's a process that the user goes through. There's an algorithm that's going on behind the scenes, and there's some impact on the data. And in this case, the impact is pretty minor. Okay, let's do the attack. Now we're going to be in much more complicated territory. So that first one was pretty straightforward, and now let's do one that's a little less straightforward. If I could get my computer to respond here. There we go. Okay, so the function is attack. And the purpose is to defeat the enemy, right? And for that purpose, there's this thing called the action bar, which allows you to select certain actions that you can apply to your monster that you're trying to defeat in order to defeat them. And I don't want to go into detail at this moment at all about the nature of actions and all that stuff. It's enough to know that you use this little user interface. It's in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, and that lower left-hand corner allows you to choose which way you're going to attack, in effect. Okay, and what's the procedure? You right-click on the mob, that's the monster. You click an ability, or choose a keyboard equivalent. So there's two user interfaces. One is a keyboard. If I press the number 1, I'll do the first one. If I press the number 2, I'll do the second one. Or I can click on one of them, and then you watch the effect. I clicked on the mob. I clicked on an action. That action happens. And of course, remember, behind the scenes, we got this communication back to the server. I observed the effect. It was a good effect. I keep going, right? I go back to step 2. And maybe I observed the effect and I didn't like it. So I click on a different one, trying something different against this mob until, until the end of the attack. Okay, you get the idea? Excuse me. From a end user perspective, I'm continually attacking over and over again using these different actions. The actions come up in this user interface. Okay, now what's the algorithm? First of all, remember, we're working with the client and the server, and we're going to go back and forth between the client and the server, and I'll pretty much ignore the data layer for a moment here and only talk about, at the end, what's the impact on the data layer. Okay, so first thing I do, I'm a client, I render the action bar and all the characters, right? I have to do that. A lot of what that fat client is doing is simply just putting the right things on the screen. So rendering the action bar with the right actions depending on my context and depending on my levels and blah, 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 is one of the things that my client has to do. So I render the user interface. I render the client bar. When I say render, I mean display, basically. Okay, then the user clicks a particular action and clicks a particular character. Remember, that's what I do. I right-click on the mob that I want to attack, and I right-click on the action that I want to take. So it observes those. Remember before we talked about recognizing commands. So your client recognizes the command, and it shows the appropriate graphics. When I choose something when I choose a particular action, my character might change to show me holding something or to show me in a certain stance or whatever. And that's what immediately my client application is going to do. It runs the mob's behavior algorithm. So when I say that, remember this monster is not controlled by a person, it's controlled by the software. And the software tells the monster how to behave. And so depending on which monster it is and depending on what you did, it has a certain algorithm, it has a certain procedure for how it behaves. And so on your client computer, it's going to engage the right behaviors, the right activities for that monster to respond to your behaviors towards it. Now, a little side note for the people who are players. Notice how I'm really not talking about World of Warcraft here. I'm talking about a computer application that can do the things that World of Warcraft does. And so if you find yourself saying, how does this map to my experience of the application? That's a good thing to do, but don't dwell on that. Don't dwell on, oh, well, it's much more complicated and, you got to do this and you got to do that. Understand that this simplification is allowing you to see the World of Warcraft through eyes that you may not have had before. How is it put together? How is it machined? How are the mechanics of World of Warcraft structured so that you can get what you want to do done. A note for people who have never played World of Warcraft: don't get hung up on the details. Go for the big picture. Go for the ideas that we have a client, we have a server, the client is communicating with the server. I need to have this thing called an attack. The attack consists of selecting who I want to attack, selecting how I want to make that attack, observing that, and doing a lot of re-rendering of the screen to make the screen change in order to reflect the things that I did. Okay, so that's what's happening on the client. Then the client communicates all that to the server, send whatever actions I took and whatever abilities that I've engaged, etc. And then the server does a lot of calculations. I said before that the server contains all the rules. A lot of the rules are, if you have these abilities and you apply these abilities to this character, and this character is in this state, this current state, then this is the impact. This is the impact on you. It drains some of your resources, for example. This is the impact on the mob. It inflicts a certain amount of damage onto the mob, etc. And it needs to be calculated. Those are algorithms that are on the server. So it does all that calculation. It figures out exactly what the impact of what you just did is, as well, don't forget, as the impact of all the other people who are participating in this event, and also in addition, the people who happen to be just walking by behind you, which all have to be taken into account as well. The computer gets a status update, the server gets a status update from you, everybody else. It does all these calculations on what's going on, what's happening, what the impact is, and then it sends it back to the client. It sends the results of the calculations, any new location updates, and then in the end, when it's done and you have defeated the monster, it sends the command to the monster to do the death dance, to do the death animation, right? And that's a certain sequence that runs for this mob when it's been killed, and it keels over, and its spirit floats up or whatever happens to it. Okay, so you got the idea. That's the algorithm. That's how it proceeds. Client does a certain set of things, rendering, sends messages to the server. Server does a bunch of calculation, sends messages back to the client. The client then goes around in that loop, around and around and around. Eventually we come to the end where the server has determined that you've killed this monster, you've killed this mob, and now it tells the mob to die. Woo! Ooh, that was a big one. That was a big slide of snow. Okay, and that's how it proceeds. Now, what's the impact on the data? At the end of this fight, a lot of stuff has happened. You have drained some of your resources. You have changed your abilities. Maybe you met some goals during that fight that now change your level, for example. There are different animations that will now come into account for you because you've evolved to a higher form of your character, etc. You have some health. You have some new abilities. As I said, you have leveling. And now there's also impacts on the mob. You have defeated that mob. That's now in your past as opposed to being in your future. Okay, so this is really how the play proceeds in Warcraft, is a series of confrontations, and at the end of each of those confrontations, there's a lot of data that needs to be stored. There's a lot of updates to your character that need to be taken into account. Okay, so we did approach, we did attack. Now let's do the final one, looting. I'm going to do a simple approach to looting. Looting is a very complicated thing in World of Warcraft, and we could spend a lot of time on the intricacies of the procedures and the algorithms, but I'm just going to keep it simple so that you get the general idea. Okay, so what's the function of looting? To acquire goods, to acquire items, to acquire objects that are valuable to you in your progress through the game. What's the user interface? I show a little bit of the user interface here. The basic idea of looting, specifically actually when you're in groups of people, is that you have to share the loot. And so the user interface really is about sharing the loot. And in the case of small groups, you use this kind of user interface that I've shown, and the user interface has a little dice rolling thing, so unless you can agree amongst yourselves who gets the loot, you usually there's various contenders for a piece of loot, and you all roll some virtual dice, and the winner of the dice roll gets that piece of loot. That's the user interface. And if you have lots and lots of people, that same process happens through chat, and there's a group leader, and the group leader decides what the parameters are. They decide how we're going to divide up the booty, how we're going to divide up the loot, and then they set thresholds for how valuable does it have to be before we care, all that kind of stuff. And then finally, the process goes, leader chooses how the dividing is going to go. You finally defeat the monster. Oh, I think I probably forgot that part of this for people who haven't played before. The loot comes from the dead monster. Okay, so you approach the monster, you attack the monster. At the end of the attack, the monster is dead, and then the monster drops all this loot, right? And you and all the other people who attack the monster together have to figure out how to divide the loot. That's this idea of looting. In small groups of people, the looting interface is the one seen here. In larger groups of people, the looting interface is through the chat messaging, through communication between people. And the basic way that it flows is before you do the attack, the group leader decides how the looting is going to occur, how the things are going to be divided, and then the actual division happens through some sort of joint decision on how it's going to be divided, or when there's more than one person contending for an item, to basically roll the dice, to have a random number that comes up and says whether you get that piece of loot or not. Okay, so let's look now more specifically at the algorithm. Okay, so first of all, we have on the client of the leader's machine, of the leader's fat client, the leader's computer, that person sets the parameters. Those parameters are communicated back up to the server, and they're stored on the server, and they're also communicated back down to all of the other people who are going to be in this particular attack, all the people in the group. Then the mob dies, the monster dies, and now it drops all its loot, and the server selects which items are going to be the loot of this particular mob. Okay, so that's a server operation. Server decides which items are in the loot of this monster, in this mob, and then it communicates that back down to the players so that they know what all the loot is. The server then tells what the items are to the clients, and it also communicates whether this is an item that you particularly need or not. So it stars, it highlights the items that are of particular interest to each player. So that's a bunch of calculation on the server side, right? Which items to have, who needs which items, and then communicate that all back down to the clients. Okay, so the client then, the server then sends all those choices. Sorry, the client displays. Sorry, the server makes all those calculations, sends it down to the client. The client then displays the items in the appropriate user interface so that people see what the loot is, and then gives the choosing selection, the choosing options, and those choosing options either come up in the UI that I showed you, or they're done via chat. Okay, and so then the clients, they send their choices, and they engage that rolling apparatus. If there needs to be a roll, they engage the rolling apparatus, and the rolling apparatus then chooses which person wins and assigns the goods to the person who won, to the person who gets those goods, or assigns the goods to the person who chose them if there was nobody in contention for those goods. And then the server sends those results of all the people and what they got assigned back down to the clients so that people can, and that automatically updates your inventory, your list of items that you've collected inside the game. Okay, so that's looting. And the impact on data is mostly, in the end, a lot of this data is stored temporarily, but in the end, what's stored permanently? What's stored permanently is that you own all of these objects that you've collected. So I was in an attack, I looted something, I looted some mob, I got 3 new objects, and I got some more money out of the mob, etc., etc., and all that is now stored in my profile so that the next time I come into the game, it's known by the computer and by my client that I own all of those objects, that they're all they're all mine. Okay, so what were we doing in this second lecture? We were going into more detail about the functions of World of Warcraft. And do I do this to teach you how to play World of Warcraft? No, I don't do this to teach you how to play World of Warcraft. I do this to teach you about the ideas of breaking an application down into smaller and smaller categories of function. For each function, we talk about the purpose of the function. What's the idea? What's the user interface? How does someone who uses the application engage this function, control this function, terminate this function? What the process is that they would use. So more like if you were writing the user manual, what you tell the person to do. First do this, then do this, then do this. And then we look at the underlying algorithm that talks specifically about what's going back, and in this case, what's going between the client computer and the server computer. What's happening on the client, the message that's sent to the server, what's happening on the server, the message that's sent to the client, and that's how we get this larger loop that we talked about in the earlier lecture between the server messaging the client, messaging the server, round and round in a loop. We've dug down into that level of detail here, but we've done it within the context of functions of World of Warcraft. We've also talked about, in the end, what's the impact on the data that's served. Now we'll talk in the next lecture a lot more about data, about the information model of World of Warcraft. But for now, I want you to understand that in the end, and this is a great, actually, from my mind, this is a really great way. I would think this. I'm an information person. In the end, the only thing that you've done after 3 hours or 30 hours or 300 hours of World of Warcraft is you've updated your database table. Right, and you've put different numbers in different slots in the database table, and you thought you were fighting creatures, and you thought you were moving around, and you thought you were trading, but really all you were doing was updating a bunch of database tables with new information. So that's kind of a, I think that's a very different way of looking at any application, that in the end, the purpose of the application is to modify, create, change, delete information, and the rest of it is just the means to that end. Okay, so we talked about the functional areas of World of Warcraft, and let me review those. If I can get my computer to move. For some reason, this computer is not wanting to respond. Come on, there we go. Okay, we said that the major things that we do in World of Warcraft is we configure characters, we form groups, and we play. We said that within play, the major things that we do is we move and we fight and we collect, we trade and communicate. And then we broke that fight thing down into what we do when we fight is we approach, we attack, and we loot. And then we went one level further and said, when we attack, it means this. Okay, and so if we were to continue down, we'd go a couple more layers down, but not too far down to where we get to the point where we could actually begin to write some computer code or look at the computer code that defines those smallest level functions. And by the way, functions is a word in computer programming we use to talk about exactly those sorts of things, those little modules, those little abilities that are all in one place, and we give them a name, and then we call that function, we engage that function in order to get the application to do something.